The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the downtown courthouse as David Johnson adjusted his tie for the third time. At 24 years old, he looked even younger than his age, but his sharp black suit and polished leather briefcase spoke of someone who meant business. Today wasn't just another day at court for David. Today was the day that would change everything. David had spent the last 3 years dreaming of this moment, though not exactly in the way it was happening. He had imagined walking into a prestigious law firm as their newest associate, shaking hands with partners who welcomed him with open arms. Instead, he was walking into this courthouse as a plaintiff, fighting for something that should have been his by right. The heavy courthouse doors opened with a deep groan and David stepped inside. The lobby buzzed with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past, their expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. Court clerks shuffled papers and called out case numbers, the smell of coffee mixed with the faint scent of old books and legal documents that seemed to live in every courthouse wall. David made his way to the elevator, pressing the button for the 5th floor. As the elevator climbed, he thought back to how he had gotten here. Just 6 months ago, he had been the proudest graduate in his law school class. He had worked harder than anyone else, staying up until 2 in the morning in the library while his classmates were out having fun. His professors had called him brilliant, his grades were perfect. When he took the bar exam, he passed with flying colors. But none of that had mattered when he started applying for jobs at the big law firms in the city. One by one, they had all said no. The rejection letters were polite but cold. "Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to pursue other candidates." Every single time it was the same story. The elevator dinged, and David stepped out onto the 5th floor. Courtroom 5B was at the end of the hall, and as he walked toward it, he could feel his heart beating faster. Through the glass doors, he could see people already gathering inside. Some were sitting in the gallery whispering to each other. Others were setting up at the tables in front of the judge's bench. David pushed open the courtroom doors and immediately felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward him. He kept his head high and walked to the plaintiff's table on the left side of the room. As he set down his briefcase and began pulling out his files, he could hear whispers behind him. "That's him? He looks so young. Are you sure he's really a lawyer?" David had heard these whispers before. He ignored them and continued organizing his papers. Everything had to be perfect. Every document had to be in exactly the right place. This case was too important to leave anything to chance. At the defendant's table across the aisle, a very different scene was playing out. Robert Hartwell was everything that David was not. At 55 years old, he commanded respect the moment he walked into any room. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His suit probably cost more than David made in 3 months, and his gold watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Hartwell had been practicing law for 30 years, and his firm, Hartwell & Associates, was one of the most powerful in the city. They represented the biggest companies, the wealthiest families, and anyone else who could afford their fees. Hartwell himself had never lost a case that really mattered to him. As David arranged his papers, he could hear Hartwell talking loudly to his team of 3 associate lawyers. Hartwell wasn't trying to keep his voice down, and David was pretty sure that was on purpose. "I still can't believe we're here for this," Hartwell said, shaking his head with a laugh. "Some kid thinks he can take on our firm because we didn't hire him? What's next? Are we going to get sued every time we don't hire someone?" One of his associates, a young woman with blonde hair, nodded eagerly. "It's ridiculous, Mr. Hartwell. Anyone can see this is just a waste of the court's time." "Exactly," Hartwell continued, his voice getting louder. "These young people today think they deserve everything handed to them. They don't understand that you have to earn your place in this business. You can't just walk in with a law degree and expect us to roll out the red carpet." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. He had learned long ago that the best response to this kind of talk was to stay focused on his work. Let his results do the talking. But Hartwell wasn't finished. "I mean, look at him," he said, and David knew without turning around that Hartwell was pointing at him. "Does he look like someone who belongs in our firm? Our clients expect a certain level of, well, let's just say they expect lawyers who fit with our company culture." The whispers in the gallery grew louder. David could feel heat rising in his cheeks, but he forced himself to stay calm. He pulled out a thick folder of documents and placed it carefully on the table. Inside that folder was evidence that would show everyone in this courtroom exactly what kind of company culture Hartwell was talking about. I bet he went to some community college law program, Hartwell continued, clearly enjoying the attention he was getting from his audience. These days, they'll give anyone a law degree if they can pay the tuition. That comment made David's pen stop moving across his legal pad. Community college law program? David had graduated from one of the best law schools in the country. He had earned every grade, every honor, every recognition through pure hard work and natural talent. But Hartwell didn't know that. And more importantly, Hartwell didn't care to know that. The courtroom doors opened again, and more people filed, and David recognized some faces from the legal community. Word had gotten around about this case, and people were curious to see what would happen. Some were probably rooting for him, but others were likely here to watch what they expected to be his public embarrassment. A court reporter wheeled in her machine and began setting up near the judge's bench. The bailiff, a tall man with graying hair, took his position near the side door where the judge would enter. The atmosphere in the room was getting more formal, more serious. David opened his briefcase one more time and pulled out a small photograph. It was a picture of his grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8 years old. She had worked 2 jobs to pay for his education, cleaning offices at night and working in a grocery store. During the day, she had never gotten to see him graduate from law school because she had passed away during his final year. But David carried her memory with him everywhere. "You show them what you're made of, baby," she had always told him. "Don't let anyone make you feel small. You're just as good as anyone else in this world." David tucked the photograph back into his briefcase and straightened his shoulders. He looked across the aisle at Hartwell, who was still holding court with his team, and anyone else who would listen to his commentary about the case. "The thing is," Hartwell was saying, "cases like this are exactly what's wrong with the legal system today. Instead of working hard and proving themselves, young lawyers want to cry discrimination every time they don't get what they want. It's pathetic, really." The bailiff suddenly stood up straighter and called out, "All rise. The Honorable Judge Patricia Chen presiding." The entire courtroom got to their feet as Judge Chen entered through the side door. She was a woman in her early 50s with short black hair and kind but serious eyes. David had researched her background extensively. She had a reputation for being fair but tough, and she didn't tolerate any nonsense in her courtroom. Judge Chen took her seat behind the bench and looked out over the courtroom. Her eyes moved from the defendant's table to the plaintiff's table, taking in both legal teams. When her gaze met David's, he thought he saw a flicker of something, maybe surprise at how young he looked, but her expression remained professional. "Please be seated," Judge Chen said, and everyone in the courtroom sat down. The sound of rustling papers and settling bodies filled the air for a moment, before silence took over. "We are here today for the case of Johnson versus Hartwell and Associates," Judge Chen announced. "This is a civil suit alleging discriminatory hiring practices. Counsel for the plaintiff, please state your name for the record." David stood up, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "David Johnson, Your Honor. I am representing myself in this matter." A murmur went through the gallery. It was unusual for someone to represent themselves in a case this important, especially against such a powerful law firm. Judge Chen nodded. "And counsel for the defendant?" Hartwell rose from his chair with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Robert Hartwell III, Your Honor, representing Hartwell and Associates. With me today are my associates Jennifer Blake, Michael Torres, and Catherine Williams." As Hartwell sat back down, David noticed him lean over to whisper something to one of his associates. Whatever he said made the associate smile and shake her head, as if they were sharing a private joke. Judge Chen looked down at the papers in front of her. "Mr. Johnson, as the plaintiff in this case, you may present your opening statement." David stood up again, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. This was it. This was his moment to tell his story, to explain why he was here and what he hoped to prove. He had practiced this opening statement dozens of times in front of his bathroom mirror, but standing here in front of a real judge and a real audience felt completely different. He walked slowly to the podium in the center of the courtroom, carrying his notes with him. As he arranged his papers and looked up at Judge Chen, he could hear Hartwell whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This should be interesting," Hartwell said with a chuckle. David took a deep breath and began to speak. David cleared his throat and looked out at the packed courtroom. Every seat was filled and people were even standing along the back wall. He had never spoken in front of so many people before, but he knew this was his chance to tell the truth. "Your Honor," David began, his voice stronger than he felt inside. "6 months ago I graduated at the top of my law school class. I had perfect grades, excellent recommendations from my professors, and I passed the bar exam on my first try. I applied to 12 law firms in this city, including Hartwell and Associates. Every single one of them rejected my application." He paused and looked directly at Hartwell, who was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, a smug smile on his face. "At first I thought maybe I just wasn't qualified enough," David continued. "Maybe my resume wasn't impressive enough for these big firms, so I went back and looked at my application again and again. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it." From the defendant's table, Hartwell whispered something to his associate that made her giggle. The sound carried across the quiet courtroom, and several people in the gallery turned to look at them with disapproval. David pressed on. "Then I started doing some research. I found out that Hartwell and Associates had hired 5 new lawyers in the past year. All of them had lower grades than me. All of them had gone to less prestigious schools than me. All of them had failed the bar exam at least once before passing." "Objection!" Hartwell suddenly stood up, his voice booming across the courtroom. "Your Honor, this is not an opening statement. This is just a list of complaints from a bitter young man who couldn't get a job." Judge Chen looked at Hartwell with raised eyebrows. "Mr. Hartwell, the plaintiff has barely begun his opening statement. Please sit down and let him finish." Hartwell sat down heavily, but David could see the anger in his eyes. This was exactly what David had expected. Hartwell didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. "As I was saying," David continued, "I began to notice a pattern in who gets hired at these firms and who doesn't. It wasn't about grades or qualifications. It was about something else entirely." David walked over to his table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I have evidence that will show this court exactly what factors Hartwell and Associates really considers when hiring new lawyers, and it has nothing to do with legal ability." Hartwell couldn't contain himself any longer. He stood up again, this time not bothering with a formal objection. "Your Honor, are we really going to sit here and listen to this young man make wild accusations against my firm? This is ridiculous." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Some people were shaking their heads at Hartwell's behavior, while others seemed to agree with him. Judge Chen banged her gavel 3 times. "Mr. Hartwell, you will sit down and remain quiet during the plaintiff's opening statement, or I will hold you in contempt of court. This is your only warning." Hartwell sat down, but David could see his face getting red with anger. This was going better than David had hoped. Hartwell was already losing his cool, and they hadn't even gotten to the real evidence yet. David finished his opening statement by explaining exactly what he planned to prove during the trial. When he sat down, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. Judge Chen called for a short recess, and David used the time to review his notes for what came next. When court resumed, it was time for David to present his evidence. He started with the basics: his transcript, his bar exam results, his letters of recommendation. Everything looked perfect on paper. There was no reason any law firm shouldn't want to hire him. Then he moved on to the more interesting evidence. He had copies of job postings from Hartwell and Associates, and he had information about every lawyer they had hired in the past 3 years. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked at the numbers objectively. But as David was explaining his research, Hartwell started making comments from his table. At first, they were quiet enough that only the people nearby could hear them. "This is such a waste of time," Hartwell muttered. "I can't believe we have to sit through this," he said to his associate. "Where did this kid even go to law school anyway?" David tried to ignore the comments and focus on his presentation, but Hartwell was getting louder and more disruptive with each passing minute. When David started talking about the specific qualifications of the lawyers that Hartwell and Associates had hired, Hartwell finally exploded. "Your Honor," Hartwell shouted, jumping to his feet. "This is absolutely ridiculous. Are we really going to let this amateur hour performance continue? This young man has no idea what he's talking about." Judge Chen looked furious. "Mr. Hartwell, I warned you about interrupting. Sit down immediately." But Hartwell was on a roll now and he couldn't seem to stop himself. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I have been practicing law in this city for 30 years. My firm has an excellent reputation, and we hire only the best candidates. Just because this young man couldn't get a job with us doesn't mean we did anything wrong." He turned toward David with a look of pure contempt. Maybe if he had spent more time learning how to be a real lawyer instead of looking for someone to blame for his failures, he wouldn't be in this situation. The courtroom gasped. Several people in the gallery were shaking their heads in disgust at Hartwell's behavior. Even some of the other lawyers in the room looked embarrassed for him, but Hartwell wasn't finished. He seemed to have completely forgotten where he was and who was watching. "The truth is, Your Honor, not everyone is cut out for this profession. Some people just don't have what it takes to work at a firm like ours. We serve very important clients who expect a certain level of professionalism and competence." He gestured toward David dismissively. "Look at him, Your Honor. Does he really look like someone who could represent the kind of clients we work with? Our clients are used to working with experienced, established lawyers who understand how business really works." David felt like he had been slapped. The insult was so blatant, so cruel, that for a moment he couldn't even respond. He looked around the courtroom and saw the shocked faces of the spectators. Some people looked angry on his behalf, while others seemed to be nodding in agreement with Hartwell. Judge Chen was banging her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to the courtroom. "Mr. Hartwell, you are completely out of line. Sit down. This instant." But Hartwell was beyond caring about the judge's warnings now. He had worked himself up into such a state that he couldn't stop talking. "Your Honor, I have built my career on excellence and results. My firm doesn't hire people based on sympathy or political correctness. We hire the best candidates, period. And sometimes that means saying no to people who just don't meet our standards." He looked directly at David again. "This young man may have good grades, but grades aren't everything. There's a difference between book smarts and real-world ability. There's a difference between studying law and actually practicing it at the highest level." David's hands were shaking with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was exactly what he had been hoping would happen. Hartwell was showing his true colors in front of everyone, and David was recording every word of it in his memory. Furthermore, Hartwell continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I find it insulting that this court is even entertaining this lawsuit. Are we really going to start requiring law firms to hire every applicant who thinks they deserve a job? Are we going to sue people just for making business decisions?" He turned to address the gallery now, as if he were giving a speech at a conference, instead of standing in a courtroom during a trial. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what's wrong with our profession today. Instead of working hard and proving themselves, young lawyers want to blame everyone else for their problems. They want to cry discrimination every time they don't get what they want." The courtroom was in complete chaos now. People were talking loudly to each other, some supporting Hartwell, and others clearly disgusted by his behavior. Judge Chen was banging her gavel so hard that David worried she might break it. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Chen shouted over the noise, "you will sit down right now, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Finally, Hartwell seemed to realize that he had gone too far. He looked around the courtroom and saw the shocked faces staring back at him. Some of his own associates were looking at him with embarrassment and concern. Your Honor, I apologize if I got a little carried away," Hartwell said, though his tone didn't sound apologetic at all. "But I stand by everything I said. This lawsuit is frivolous, and everyone in this room knows it." He sat down heavily in his chair, still breathing hard from his outburst. The courtroom slowly began to quiet down as Judge Chen continued banging her gavel. David sat at his table, his heart pounding but his mind racing. Everything was going exactly according to plan. Hartwell had just shown everyone in the courtroom exactly the kind of person he really was. The mask had slipped completely off and there was no putting it back on now. But David knew that this was just the beginning. The real fireworks were still to come. He had evidence that would shock everyone in this courtroom, including Hartwell himself. Evidence that would prove once and for all that David's case wasn't frivolous at all. Judge Chen finally restored order to the courtroom and looked sternly at both tables. "We will take a 15-minute recess," she announced. "When we return, I expect everyone in this courtroom to conduct themselves with appropriate dignity and respect. Mr. Hartwell, I want to see you in my chambers immediately." As the judge left the bench and the courtroom began to empty for the recess, David remained seated at his table. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, some sympathetic and others curious about what he would do next. Hartwell walked past David's table on his way to the judge's chambers, and as he did, he leaned down and whispered just loud enough for David to hear. "You have no idea who you're messing with, kid. This little show of yours is going to backfire spectacularly." David looked up at Hartwell with a calm smile. "We'll see about that, Mr. Hartwell, we'll see about that." The 15-minute recess felt like hours to David. He sat alone at his table while most people left the courtroom to stretch their legs or grab coffee. A few spectators came up to him, offering words of encouragement. "Don't let him get to you," an elderly woman whispered as she walked past. "You're doing great, young man." A middle-aged lawyer David had never met before stopped at his table. "I've been practicing for 20 years and I've never seen anything like what just happened." Hartwell completely lost his mind out there. David appreciated the support, but his mind was focused on what came next. During the recess, he had made a phone call that would change everything. Now he just had to wait and see if his plan would work. When Judge Chen returned from her chambers, she looked stern but composed. Hartwell followed behind her, and David noticed that some of the arrogance had gone out of his posture. Whatever the judge had said to him in private had clearly made an impact. "Court is back in session," the bailiff announced, and everyone took their seats. Judge Chen looked directly at Hartwell before speaking. "Mr. Hartwell, I have made it very clear that any further outbursts will result in you being held in contempt of court. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Hartwell replied quietly, though David could see the anger still burning in his eyes. "Good," Judge Chen said. "Mr. Johnson, you may continue with your presentation of evidence." David stood up and walked back to the podium. The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone waiting to see what would happen next after Hartwell's explosive outburst. "Your Honor," David began, "before the recess, Mr. Hartwell made several statements about my qualifications and my worthiness to practice law. He suggested that I don't have what it takes to work at a firm like his." David paused and looked directly at Hartwell, who was staring back at him with undisguised contempt. "I think it's important for this court to understand exactly what my qualifications are, so that everyone can judge for themselves whether Mr. Hartwell's assessment was accurate." David walked back to his table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness." Hartwell looked confused. This wasn't what he had expected. In his mind, this case was supposed to be simple. A young lawyer with hurt feelings makes some wild accusations, presents no real evidence, and gets laughed out of court. But now David was calling witnesses, and Hartwell suddenly realized that maybe he had underestimated his opponent. "I call Professor Elizabeth Rodriguez to the stand," David announced. The courtroom doors opened and a distinguished woman in her 50s walked in. She was wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a briefcase. As she made her way to the witness stand, people in the gallery whispered to each other, "Who is that? Is she a lawyer? She looks important." Professor Rodriguez was sworn in and took her seat. David approached the witness stand with a confidence that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including himself. "Professor Rodriguez, could you please tell the court your current position and background?" "Certainly," Professor Rodriguez replied in a clear, strong voice. "I am a professor at Harvard Law School, where I have taught for the past 15 years. Before that, I practiced law for 10 years at some of the top firms in Boston and New York." A murmur went through the courtroom. Harvard Law School was one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. What was a Harvard professor doing here? Professor Rodriguez, do you know the plaintiff in this case, David Johnson? Yes, I do. David was one of my students during his time at Harvard Law School. David could see the shock on Hartwell's face. Harvard Law School? The young man he had been mocking and insulting was a Harvard graduate? Professor Rodriguez, could you tell the court about David's performance as a student? Professor Rodriguez smiled slightly. David was an exceptional student. In my 15 years of teaching, I have rarely encountered someone with his combination of intelligence, work ethic, and natural legal ability. She turned to look directly at David. He graduated summa cum laude, which means he was in the top 5% of his class. But more than that, David achieved something that no student had done in over a decade. What was that? David asked. He earned a perfect 4.0 grade point average while simultaneously completing a master's degree in business administration. He was also the first student in Harvard's history to receive a perfect score on both the constitutional law final exam and the civil procedure comprehensive exam in the same semester. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Hartwell's associates were staring at David with new eyes. This wasn't some community college graduate trying to get lucky in court. This was a Harvard law genius. Professor Rodriguez, you mentioned David's natural legal ability. Could you elaborate on that? Absolutely. David has an incredible memory for legal precedents and an intuitive understanding of how different areas of law connect to each other. But what really set him apart was his ability to analyze complex legal problems and find creative solutions that other students missed. She paused and looked around the courtroom. I remember one particular case study where 25 students spent weeks trying to find a legal strategy for our hypothetical client. David found 3 different approaches that would work, and he presented them all in a 20-page brief that was better than work I've seen from practicing attorneys with 10 years of experience. David could see people in the gallery shaking their heads in amazement. Hartwell was sitting perfectly still, his face pale. One more question, Professor Rodriguez. Based on your experience in both academic and professional settings, would you say that David Johnson is qualified to work at any major law firm in the country? Professor Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Absolutely. David is not just qualified to work at a major firm. He's qualified to be a partner at a major firm. Any law firm in the country would be lucky to have him. Thank you, Professor Rodriguez. No further questions. David returned to his table while Hartwell stood up for cross-examination, but it was clear that he was rattled. The arrogant lawyer who had been making jokes and insults just an hour ago now looked uncertain and off balance. Professor Rodriguez, Hartwell began, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Isn't it true that academic performance doesn't always translate to real-world success? That's sometimes true, Professor Rodriguez replied calmly. But in David's case, I'm confident that his real-world performance would exceed even his exceptional academic record. Hartwell tried a few more questions, but it was obvious that he was just going through the motions. Every answer made David look better and made Hartwell's earlier comments look worse. When Professor Rodriguez stepped down, David stood up again. Your Honor, I'd like to present my next piece of evidence. He walked to his table and picked up a small digital recorder. This is a recording that was made at the annual State Bar Association conference 6 months ago. The recording was made legally by someone who was disturbed by what they heard and felt. It was important to preserve it. Hartwell suddenly looked very nervous. Your Honor, I object. We don't know anything about this recording or how it was obtained. Mr. Hartwell, Judge Chen said firmly, you've already interrupted these proceedings enough for one day. Mr. Johnson, please continue. David pressed play on the recorder. At first, there was just background noise and the sound of people talking at what was obviously some kind of social event. Then, clear as day, they heard Hartwell's voice. The thing is, we have to be very careful about who we hire these days. Our clients have certain expectations about the kind of lawyers who represent them. Another voice, which David identified as one of Hartwell's partners, could be heard agreeing. Absolutely. We can't just hire anyone, even if they look good on paper. Exactly, Hartwell's voice continued. We've built our reputation on maintaining a certain standard, a certain image. Our clients are comfortable with lawyers who fit with our firm culture. The recording continued and Hartwell's words became even more damaging. We get applications from all kinds of people, but we have to think about what's best for our business. Sometimes that means making tough decisions about who fits and who doesn't. The courtroom was dead silent as everyone listened to the recording. David could see several people in the gallery looking disgusted as they heard Hartwell's words, but the most damaging part was still to come. On the recording, someone asked Hartwell directly about his hiring practices. Hartwell's recorded voice was clear and unmistakable. Well, we look at grades and experience, of course, but we also have to consider whether someone is going to fit with our client base. Our clients are mostly wealthy business owners and established families. They expect to work with lawyers who understand their world, who come from similar backgrounds. What do you mean by similar backgrounds? There was a pause on the recording, and then Hartwell's voice came through again, quieter, but still audible. Let's just say that our clients are more comfortable working with lawyers who look and sound like them. It's not about discrimination. It's about business. It's about giving our clients what they want. David stopped the recording. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Everyone was staring at Hartwell, who looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Your Honor, David said quietly, I think this recording speaks for itself. Mr. Hartwell has made it very clear what his hiring practices are really based on. Judge Chen was looking at Hartwell with an expression of complete disgust. Mr. Hartwell, is that your voice on the recording? Hartwell opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face was bright red, and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. Mr. Hartwell, I asked you a question. Your Honor, that recording was taken out of context. I was speaking casually at a social event. I didn't mean, so it is your voice? Yes, but thank you, Judge Chen said curtly. Mr. Johnson, do you have any other evidence to present? David smiled for the first time since the trial began. Yes, Your Honor. I have one more surprise. He walked back to his table and pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the first. Your Honor, I have here copies of internal emails from Hartwell and Associates dating back 3 years. These emails show a clear pattern of discriminatory hiring practices. Hartwell jumped to his feet. Your Honor, those emails are privileged. He can't possibly have legal access to internal firm communications. David turned to face Hartwell with a calm smile. Actually, Mr. Hartwell, these emails were provided to me by a current employee of your firm who was disgusted by what they saw and decided to become a whistleblower. Everything was obtained legally and ethically. He opened the folder and began reading from the first email. This is from Mr. Hartwell to his hiring committee, dated 18 months ago. Quote, the Johnson application looks good on paper, but I don't think he's the right fit for our image. Let's pass on this one. End quote. David looked up at the stunned courtroom. That email is about me, Your Honor. My application was rejected before anyone at the firm ever met me or interviewed me. The decision was made based purely on my name and photograph. He continued reading from other emails, each one more damaging than the last. The evidence painted a clear picture of a law firm that made hiring decisions based on factors that had nothing to do with legal qualifications. By the time David finished presenting his evidence, the courtroom was in complete shock. Hartwell sat at his table with his head in his hands while his associates stared at him in horror. David returned to his table and sat down. Your Honor, I believe the evidence speaks for itself. This case isn't about hurt feelings or a young lawyer looking for sympathy. This is about systematic discrimination and illegal hiring practices. Judge Chen looked at Hartwell, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past hour. Mr. Hartwell, do you have anything to say for yourself? Hartwell slowly stood up, but he could barely meet the judge's eyes. For the first time since David had known of his existence, the arrogant, powerful lawyer looked completely defeated. Hartwell stood behind his table, swaying slightly as if the weight of everything that had just happened was too much for him to bear. The man who had walked into the courtroom that morning with complete confidence now looked broken and defeated. His expensive suit suddenly seemed too big for him, and his hands were shaking as he tried to organize his papers. Your Honor, Hartwell began, his voice barely above a whisper, I, my firm has always tried to hire the best candidates available. Judge Chen's expression was stern as she looked down at him. Mr. Hartwell, I've just heard clear evidence that your firm makes hiring decisions based on factors that have nothing to do with legal qualifications. Do you have any explanation for this? Hartwell opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. His associates were all staring at their hands, too embarrassed to look at anyone else in the courtroom. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes. Finally, Hartwell managed to speak. Your Honor, I admit that some of my comments may have been inappropriate, but I want to assure the court that my firm does not intentionally discriminate against anyone. David could hardly believe what he was hearing. Even now, even after all the evidence had been presented, Hartwell was still trying to deny what everyone in the courtroom had heard with their own ears. Judge Chen clearly wasn't buying it either. Mr. Hartwell, we have heard recordings of your own voice describing discriminatory hiring practices. We have seen internal emails that show a pattern of rejecting qualified candidates for reasons that have nothing to do with their legal abilities. How can you stand there and claim that your firm doesn't discriminate? Hartwell's face turned red again, but this time it wasn't from anger. It was from shame and embarrassment. Your Honor, I don't know what to say. Then perhaps you should. Sit down and let me make my ruling, Judge Chen said firmly. Hartwell collapsed into his chair like a deflated balloon. David had never seen such a complete transformation in another human being. The arrogant, powerful lawyer who had been making jokes and insults just hours ago was now a broken man who couldn't even string together a coherent sentence. Judge Chen looked out over the packed courtroom. Every single person was hanging on, her every word, waiting to hear what she would decide. In my 20 years on the bench, Judge Chen began, I have presided over thousands of cases. I have seen lawyers at their best and at their worst, but I have never seen anything quite like what I witnessed in this courtroom today. She paused and looked directly at Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell, your behavior during this trial has been absolutely disgraceful. You interrupted the proceedings repeatedly, you made inappropriate comments about the plaintiff, and you showed a level of disrespect for this court that I find shocking. David could see several people in the gallery nodding in agreement. Even some of the other lawyers in the room were shaking their heads in disgust at Hartwell's behavior. But more importantly, Judge Chen continued, the evidence presented in this case shows a clear pattern of discriminatory hiring practices at your firm. The recordings and emails that Mr. Johnson has presented paint a picture of a law firm that makes hiring decisions based on factors that are not only inappropriate, but illegal. She turned to look at David. Mr. Johnson, you have presented your case with professionalism, intelligence, and grace. Despite facing personal attacks and inappropriate comments, you maintained your composure and focused on the facts. That takes real character. David felt a warmth spreading through his chest. After months of rejection and humiliation, someone in a position of authority was finally recognizing his worth. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, Judge Chen said. Mr. Johnson was clearly the most qualified candidate for any position at Hartwell and Associates. His academic record is exceptional, his legal knowledge is impressive, and his professionalism is evident to everyone in this courtroom. She looked back at Hartwell. The fact that your firm rejected his application without even granting him an interview shows that your hiring process is fundamentally flawed and discriminatory. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Chen prepared to announce her decision. Therefore, I find in favor of the plaintiff, David Johnson. Hartwell and Associates engaged in discriminatory hiring practices in violation of federal and state employment laws. The courtroom erupted in applause. People were clapping, cheering, and calling out words of support for David. He sat at his table, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. He had won. After all these months of doubt and rejection, he had actually won, but Judge Chen wasn't finished. She banged her gavel to restore order and continued with her ruling. Mr. Johnson, you are awarded damages in the amount of $200,000 for lost wages and emotional distress. The applause grew even louder. David felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he fought them back. This wasn't just about the money. This was about justice and proving that he belonged in this profession. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued, I am ordering Hartwell and Associates to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees within 60 days. The firm will also be required to submit annual reports on their hiring practices to ensure compliance with employment laws. David could see Hartwell slumping further into his chair with each word of the ruling. The man's career and reputation were in ruins, and everyone knew it. Finally, Judge Chen said, I want to commend Mr. Johnson for his courage in bringing this case forward. It takes tremendous strength to stand up to powerful people and institutions, especially when you're doing it alone. She looked directly at David. You have shown everyone in this courtroom that excellence and determination can overcome prejudice and discrimination. I have no doubt that you will have a successful and distinguished career in the law. As Judge Chen banged her gavel one final time and declared the court adjourned, the entire courtroom erupted in celebration. People rushed toward David's table to congratulate him, shake his hand, and offer their support. The first person to reach him was Professor Rodriguez, who gave him a warm hug. I'm so proud of you, David. You handled that perfectly. Behind her came a line of other lawyers, court officials, and spectators who all wanted to congratulate David on his victory. But the most meaningful moment came when an elderly black man approached him with tears in his eyes. Son, the man said, placing a hand on David's shoulder, you just did something important here today. You didn't just win a case, you opened a door for other young people who might face the same kind of treatment. David felt the tears coming again, and this time he didn't try to stop them. Thank you, sir. That means everything to me. As the crowd around David continued to grow, he noticed that Hartwell and his associates were quietly packing up their materials and trying to leave without being noticed. But reporters and other lawyers were already surrounding them, asking questions about the case and what this meant for their firm's future. One reporter managed to corner Hartwell near the courtroom doors. Mr. Hartwell, do you have any comment on today's ruling? Hartwell looked haggard and defeated. No comment, he mumbled, pushing past the reporter and hurrying out of the courtroom. But the reporter wasn't finished. Will you be appealing the decision? What changes will you be making at your firm? Hartwell stopped and turned around, his face showing a mixture of anger and embarrassment. I said no comment, he snapped, before disappearing through the doors. Meanwhile, David was being interviewed by several other reporters who wanted to hear his side of the story. How does it feel to win such an important case, Gen? One reporter asked. David thought for a moment before answering. It feels like justice has been served. But this case was never just about me. It was about making sure that all qualified lawyers get a fair chance regardless of what they look like or where they come from. What's next for you? Another reporter asked. I'm going to start my own practice, David said with a smile. I want to help other people who have faced discrimination and need someone to fight for them. Over the next few weeks, the story of David's victory spread throughout the legal community and beyond. The case made headlines in newspapers and legal journals across the country. Law schools began using it as a case study in their ethics classes. And most importantly, young lawyers from diverse backgrounds began reaching out to David for advice and support. 3 months after the trial, David opened his own law office in a small building downtown. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it was his. The sign outside read, Johnson Legal Services, Fighting for Justice and Equality. His first client was a young woman who had been discriminated against by her employer. His second was an elderly man who had been cheated out of his pension. Word spread quickly that David Johnson was a lawyer who would fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Within 6 months, David's practice was thriving. He had hired 2 associates and was handling cases throughout the state. But he never forgot where he came from or what had brought him to this point. Every morning when David walked into his office, he looked at the framed newspaper article hanging on his wall. The headline read, Young Lawyer Defeats Discrimination in Stunning Court Victory. But what David treasured most was the quote from Judge Chen that was highlighted in the article. Excellence and determination can overcome prejudice and discrimination. Year after the trial, David received a letter that made him smile. It was from a young law student who had heard about his case and was inspired to pursue a career in civil rights law. Dear Mr. Johnson, the letter read, I wanted to thank you for showing me that it's possible to stand up to powerful people and win. Your case gave me the courage to believe that I can make a difference too. David kept that letter in his desk drawer along with dozens of others just like it. Every time he felt discouraged or faced a difficult challenge, he would read those letters and remember why he had chosen this profession. The law wasn't just about winning cases or making money. It was about fighting for what was right, standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, and making sure that everyone got a fair chance to succeed. As David looked out the window of his office at the busy street below, he thought about how much his life had changed since that day in the courtroom. He had gone from being rejected and humiliated to becoming a respected lawyer with a growing practice and a bright future. But more than that, he had proven that talent and hard work could overcome any obstacle. He had shown that justice was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible. And most importantly, he had opened doors for the next generation of lawyers who would face their own challenges and fight their own battles for equality and justice.